Hello, my name is Jonah P. Overton. My pronouns are they, them, theirs.
My name is Cameron Malachi Overton. My pronouns are he, him, his, and welcome to Christian Queeries,
where two Christian queers answer your queries about Christianity. This is where we normally have our little theme song, and we are live recording an episode, so thank you for joining us for that. Our podcast, Christian Queeries, is an ongoing project that came out of the life of our community, Zao MKE Church, where Cameron and I co-pastor. And we realized that there were a lot of questions that people have about Christianity, about faith, about spirituality, that it's not always easy to get queer answers about. And so we designed this podcast to be a submission-based kind of Q&A type scenario. And so we have many episodes that are already out. We took a hiatus and we are back in the swing again. And we like to start our time together off with Lifeway Bible Bible study icebreaker questions. It's been really enlightening this season as we've gone through them.
Good evangelical pastors that we are.
Yeah,
you know?
Reclaim it. Reclaim it. So the deep and wonderful truth-revealing icebreaker from Lifeway Bible this week is...
I'm ready.
What is your favorite childhood cereal?
Oh, there's so many.
I know. So many forbidden. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a no sugary cereal household. So they were all of this is forbidden fruit.
I grew up in a household where we went to the food shelf and whatever was there, that's what we got. So we got all sorts of cereal. There was always cereal and it was always sugary. So, but I actually don't like a lot of sugary cereal. But I will confess that a good old just bowl of Frosted Flakes, just really hits sometimes. So I'm going to go with that. That's my final answer.
My memory is of the Aldi knockoff of Captain Crunch. Deliciously sugary corn nonsense, but shaped in a way not to cut up the roof of your mouth.
Oh.
So point to the knockoff.
Hey,
right?
knockoffs, right. Yes.
All right. Let's get into the meat of our query. The query we're starting with today is about the nature of this conference. So for listeners at home who are not joining us in person, we are at the Q Christian Fellowship Conference, which is a gathering of LGBTQ people and allies in the church, and an incredible assortment collection of people and communities and minds and musicians, folks coming together to have a collective experience. And so the question that we have for today is, why gather in this way? Why gather in this way when so many of us would like to be sort of integrated into the life of the quote-unquote regular church? Why have spaces that are set aside for queerness as kind of a central identity and topic? Is that helping us to become integrated into the life of the church?
That's for me.
That's for us.
Whew. All right, here we go. Well, first, I want to just acknowledge and recognize that we are church planters, right? And so we started a church. We're both queer and trans people. We started a church, and every Sunday, this is our church, right? We have. It was weird. We're on a plane, and you're next to straight people, and I'm kind of I forget that I'm not. That I'm not in queer space all the time now, and so it's odd to enter out of that space. But for most people, for most queer and trans folks, we don't have this space all the time. And I know that I have great privilege to be in a church that is like this every Sunday. And so it's so important to have a space that is safe, that you can show up exactly who you need to be, exactly who you are, exactly who you might be becoming. And so you can know that there are people around you, that they're all over the world potentially, that are with you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard a lot of that at the conference so far. A lot of people saying, I have that opportunity here to be myself, to feel to feel safe. And I think that safety, there are a lot of people who will kind of be dismissive of safety, which it sounds like a strange thing to say, but I think in our culture, safety, especially with, people sort of on the right, on the hard right, are like, oh, safety, you don't want to be challenged, you don't want anyone to disagree with you, you're such a snowflake. But when people are articulating safety here, it's first of all literal physical safety, which is not guaranteed in other spaces, and second of all, it's the safety to know that you can be yourself without the fear that in order to protect your well-being, you have to mask, that you have to hide, that you have to shift who you are and how you speak, how you move, how you dress, how you behave in order to hide in plain sight. So I think that, for many people, the safety of being able to just like let your guard down and feel like it's okay to be seen, that being seen is not a dangerous thing, but something valuable. And I think, especially in the context of spirituality and Christian community, what can be more holy than being seen, being known? It was the evangelicals that taught me that to know God was to love God, and to seek to love God was to seek to know God. And so I trust that is reciprocated by God and ought to be reciprocated by community. And so if this is an opportunity for us to be seen and known the way that God sees and knows us, that in it, and we could be playing kickball, we could be doing whatever, but I think having a gathering that allows people to come and be seen and rest in being seen and being loved is a holy experience.
When I was going to mention, there are so many of those spaces, like kickball. We have a queer kickball.
Kickball, dodgeball,
yeah,
soccer.
Yeah.
The gays love to sport.
Exactly. Well, do we? But there's lots of those spaces, but how many of those spaces are, I'm going to bring up a weird, intersectional,
sure.
Right? And what that, for this second, means loving Jesus and being your full self, right? So oftentimes we have to shut off. If you go to church, you can not be gay, right? But then if you go and you're your full queer self, you also don't get to talk about Jesus, right? And so there is so much of that flip-flopping that you have to do. And so to have a space that you can do both of those things is really important. And that's the idea of a affinity space, that it is safe, and you don't have to teach people. You don't have to shut things off, but you get to just show up.
And I think that's why these types of conferences need to be sort of occasional, right? Because we do want to be a people that teaches. We do want to be a people that learns. We want to grow spaces beyond us, and we deserve spaces where we know that we don't have to do that, that we know that we can just rest and be. But I think the other thing for me is that, there is the premise of the question is about integrated into the life of the church, and for lots of people, the goal has been for a long time to be able to be gay at church, right? And I think that even the origins of this community, there is this kind of I just want to be myself in the spaces that exist, and because I can't do that, I come here. And I think that there's some element of truth to that we need to transform our community spaces to be more accepting, affirming. That's kind of a given here, right? And I think it would be an absolute tragedy if queerness simply assimilated to the American heteronormative church. And so being able to step outside of the norms of straight people church, cis people church, and come together and say well, what actually does it mean to us to be queer and Christian, or to be trans and Christian, or whatever, Q identities we're bringing into this space, but to be able to say hey, there is actually something set apart about us. And our faith calls us to embody spirituality and relationship to God and to neighbor in a fundamentally different way. And being able to hold on. So I think that there are some folks that would say well, we hope that someday these gatherings will not be necessary. And I think that the only scenario in which that is true is a completely liberated, transformed church that is queer and trans in its theology and politic from top to bottom. And I think we have a little ways to go.
Just a little.
little ways to go before we get there, because I think being accepted and not targeted in church is like an absolute bottom floor for us to clear in terms of the spiritual mission of what it means to be a queer person of faith.
Well, and that's a whole journey. I mean, like, and I remember back in the day when I was at my first church that was like welcoming. And I was like, it can get no better than this. And I really didn't understand until like we did a new thing and like started a new church to say like from the get-go, we are Jesus rooted, justice centered, and radically inclusive. And radically inclusive means that we hold up the most marginalized first, right? And like that was a completely and utterly different orientation to my faith and to like what I now expect and I demand of other people. And like whatever space I walk into, I am asking, what's your radical inclusion statement? And if they don't have one, I'm like, then this isn't it. Like, because I deserve better than this. I deserve better than just to like be tolerated, right? And like I deserve to be like seen, and I deserve to be like held up and say like, you actually have something special that I don't have, because like your queerness and your transness like helps me understand God and Jesus in such a different way than I could ever, right? And that's the difference, I think, than you know, again, trying to just assimilate into what currently exists. And I didn't understand that, and it's been a long journey to get there.
I think that part of that that conversation then, though, is defining queerness, right? What does it mean to be queer? What does it mean to be trans? How are each of us coming in with our various identities self-conceptualizing? Because for me, especially the longer that I stay deeply rooted in queer relationship, in trans-led community, and in my faith in Jesus Christ, the more I say, oh, I'm queer like Black Lives Matter. I'm queer like Free Palestine. So, you know, I think that there is an element to centering marginalized identity that necessarily moves into the politics of solidarity. And so I think that to the extent that queer folks can continue to identify on the margins, even as queerness has become more normative, right? Which is lovely. You know, it's so wonderful to see queer and trans television characters and more queer and trans people being ordained and all of these things. And if we are to be faithful to what queerness actually means, I believe that means sort of that remaining commitment to the margins, and understanding at a personal level what it means for Jesus to say like, oh yeah, this is where my ministry lies. This is where the identity roots of Christian community lies. Because if we just take that access to the seats of power, especially, you know, like white queer trans people, if we're just sort of like, great, we made it, then actually I think it's not only a betrayal of our faith, but it's also a betrayal of our queerness, to just say like, hey, we've gotten close enough that now I get a seat at this table that was all too happy to leave me out before.
Well, and I think that's what tends to happen, right? Like once you get quote unquote liberated, then like, are you walking in solidarity to again, asking that question about radical inclusion, right? Like, who is the most marginalized in this moment? And like, I think as a Black, queer, and trans person, it's so often that, you know, I'm in spaces where, you know, it's a very white space and it's not inclusive of my Blackness. And even if it's an affinity space for like queer people, what does that mean, right? Because not all queer people are the same people, right? If it's an affinity space for trans people, not all trans people are the same. It's an affinity space for Black people, not all Black people are the same, right? And so, like, I think that's always the question that we should be having, and that is the political kind of like queering the world, should be asking that question, like, how do we stand in solidarity with one another, and not just getting the thing to make you feel best and then walking on and leaving others out. And that is like historically the constant thing that is going on, right? We're both trans people. Trans people are under attack in this country right now, and the most like saddening thing that I think is happening is that we're ending up having conversations in LGBTQ spaces where people are LGBTQ people are not standing with like trans folks, right? Or like saying things against trans folks. And I'm like, wait a second. Like this was like 10 seconds ago where we had like marriage equality, quote unquote, for people who can't see my hands. And like that, we didn't like win the world when that happened, right? Like we need to keep pushing forward. We need to keep asking the questions like who's in power and who's being impacted and how can we again continue to be in solidarity and make more and more people free, because really you're not free until I'm free, and I'm not free until you're truly free. So we need to get there.
I think you raise an interesting point about affinity spaces and affinity spaces limitations, because especially for people with many intersecting identities of marginalization, yourself included, right? There's just a limit, like so it's like, okay, it's a queer space, but it's gotta be a queer Christian space, but it's gotta be a queer and trans Christian space, but it's also gotta be a queer and trans Black Christian space. And like, there's all, you whittle it, right? And it's like, the beauty of affinity spaces is safety, recognition, connection, being seen and known. I think the danger of affinity spaces is that the more marginalized you are, the smaller your possible affinity connection is. And so I think that for those of us that have identities of marginalization and identities of privilege, affinity spaces can feel so great because it's like, oh, great, like I'm not the only queer person in the room, but my whiteness gives me like this enormous barrier to understanding the experience of like BIPOC queer folks, for instance. And I think that, leaning into affinity spaces to create that sense of safety and connection is amazing. And I actually really love sort of what's happening here at this conference. There are affinity spaces, right? They're like day one, there are different affinity groups. But on the whole, I think that bringing folks together with different marginalized identities in sort of the same milieu, right? Which is the whole premise behind, whatever, the alphabet army, what do they call us? The rainbow people? Yeah. But the whole premise behind that is that those of us who the affinity we share is of marginalization. And there is me and like my commitment to solidarity. I believe that like true solidarity, the liberation that Jesus describes in the kingdom is only going to come when we have everybody, including people of enormous, seemingly limitless privilege, right? Like the kingdom will only exist when we have everybody on board. And I think that there's the most potential for organizing for solidarity across different identities of oppression. And so being able to say, hey, we may not share all the same identities, but we share an experience of oppression and of outsiderness that allows us to build a deep understanding and build power. And this is why I think you see Jesus like organizing with people who had different experiences of marginalization, and saying like, hey, you all might not really get each other, but you know what it feels to have like the boot of the Roman Empire on your neck, and you know what it feels like to be completely rejected and isolated from your religious and spiritual authorities and communities. And so we're just gonna start there. And I think that that's why you can see some of the most powerful and I think makes me most emotional solidarity happening across the world, right? This is when you see like Palestinians sending pizza to the front lines at Ferguson, and people saying like, I see, the American police force is here, right? Like I see, I'm not a Black American, say, Palestinians, but I know what it's like to live under occupation. And I see that in you. And it can be very radicalizing, but also very there are allies across the world. There are people in solidarity all over the globe who say, our commitment to liberation is the same.
Well, and that's the power, right? Like I was thinking while you were talking about, back in the day when I would sit around a table, this was a while ago, but we're trying to figure out how to do this like third way thing, right? Where it's like, hi, I'm on this side of the table and I think you're going to hell, right? And then I'm over here and I'm like, oh, but I don't think I'm going to hell because I think this is what the Bible says. And then there's people in the middle who are like, oh, we don't know what we think, but like we love everyone, right? So what if our whole church was like this? This is what we're trying to do, right? But the problem with that setup is the power analysis of that. And what like you're speaking to is the fact that like there might some of the powerful movement work that I think about is like Fred Hampton, right? Like Black Panthers, right? Where like Fred Hampton goes out and is like, hey, poor white people, right? You know that there's some like messed up stuff happening to you and like no one's listening to you. How does that feel, right? And hey, black people, like obviously this world is not like for you. And hey, like Puerto Rican folk, like so bringing together all these people who knew what it was like to like have power on top of you and have people who aren't speaking to those experiences, and those were the movements that like broke out into like these huge movements so quickly because what you're saying, right? But it's that power analysis where when you're sitting around a table with privileged folks who are not willing to enter into solidarity, we're actually having a privilege conversation. We're not having a radical solidarity conversation, and that's the difference.
Yeah, well, yeah, because what you're talking about, including that third way approach, it really centers the feelings of the people who have not been oppressed. And it's really, I love your example of Fred Hampton because like what he was doing is wild, absolutely wild, which is why, the FBI murdered him. But
little things.
Look at Fred Hampton if you don't know his incredible work. But what's wild about that is that the white people that Fred Hampton was trying to organize in Chicago had like Confederate flags and stuff. And he's going to organize the black gangs and the Puerto Rican gangs and the like white Confederate flag flying poor folks who were living in similar conditions in the city. And what's amazing about that analysis from Fred Hampton is that instead of kind of pandering to, pleading with, negotiating with power and saying like, hey, like accept us, going to like white folks in power or even black folks who had attained power in the city at that point, instead of saying like, hey, we want to negotiate and build alliances with those in power, it was, hey, we want to negotiate and build alliances with other people who are being marginalized, and say, hey, like, do you not recognize your experience in mine and my experience in yours? And that's the kind of thing that actually really does threaten power to the point that it will get you killed, which I think as Christians, we should always be looking to figure out how to listen, Jesus, the state killed Jesus Christ, the state killed Fred P. Hampton. Yeah. Like we should keep an eye.
Next year, Jonah P. Overton murdered by the FBI.
Let's hope not. But I do think
you to be around. Thank you. Yeah.
I do think that we should be keeping an eye on the types of organizing that are the most threatening to power. I mean, like we look at Martin Luther King Jr. This is Martin Luther King Jr. weekend when we're recording this, and MLK. It makes me so mad. Every MLK Day, MLK gets quoted on Twitter by like the U.S. Navy, right? Like military apparatuses. When MLK was a very deeply anti-war, anti-military activist, and he organized, but the thing that culminated in his assassination was when he started to organize mostly white sanitation workers alongside the existing power of the Black Civil Rights Movement to say like, hey, again, like let us not negotiate sort of up in this hierarchy of oppression. Let us negotiate across with those who are on the bottom with us. Because in the end, there are more of us, right? And if we can find the dignity and humanity in one another, that's where our real power lies. And so I think that, organize to kind of come back to the root of this question a little bit, like organizing towards solidarity across different experiences of marginalization in the church is always going to be more powerful and more threatening to the status quo than trying to plead with those in power to accept us. And the creativity and generativity of collaborating across experiences of marginalization is where like holy work happens. And I think that part of that is just putting us into conversation with each other, putting us into space with each other. You've written like 2 songs since you've been here. Like there's so much art and beauty and creativity and theology happening here. And I think that the more we can expand that around the edges, around the margins, rather than pleading our case to the centers of power, the more we're actually hitting on what is holy and good.
Boom. Mic drop.
You want to wrap it?
Wrapped. Are we going to do some?
Yeah, I mean, we do have an audience here with us. So if any of you have queries for us, now would be the time. And we do have a few minutes that we could take any questions that you all might have.
Yeah.
How do you create affinity spaces in your church?
How do we create affinity spaces in our church?
Is this primarily a practical question, a theological question? Not sure? Both. All of it. All right. Yeah. How do we create affinity spaces in church? One of the things that happens, we're church planters. And something that happens with church plants is that churches tend to mirror the identities of their planters. It's just like, it's something that's true. Like lots of people are fighting to find ways not to do that and whatever. So we accidentally created like a super trans church just by like being trans people. So I think part of it is, I always talk about how evangelism itself is being yourself in public. And I think that a big part of what kind of newfound safety and acceptance, always teetering, right? Like obviously it's not a very safe time to be out as a trans person in this country. And yet in some ways it's safer than it has been in the past, right? So making oneself visible, which is something that we couldn't always do, is a form of evangelism. And it creates the opportunity for people to find you, right? And to say like, oh, this can exist. Like how many people have come to Zao and been like, I just didn't know a church like this could exist. We've sent people to seminary who have come to us being like, I didn't know that someone like me could be a pastor. So that's what I would first say, that in terms of creating affinity spaces, that it partly like requires just like putting yourself out there and saying like, I'm here, who's with me? Now, I think then similarly, do you want to?
I was just going to say practically, I mean, like, it's interesting because like at a Zao, we don't have like a queer group. Like we don't have a trans group because like church is effing gay, so like we just like that is every Sunday, and so we don't have those things. One of the spaces that we do have is like we have a Black space and we have a Latina space, and like we are trying to actively cultivate those spaces so that we can, I think, like more integrate that into the wholeness of who we are. So I think I don't want to like. I don't know our statistics per se, but we are like majority white space, but like almost not, and so. But I think because of the types of things that we created together, one of the things that we're doing right now actively is like changing our whole service, like changing how we do everything. And I think that's the beauty of being the kind of church that we are, and that's the privilege that we hold, which is to say like, we're a church plant, we make the rules, and so we just like smash them and try different things all the time. And so some of the questions that we have are like, what what does that radical inclusion look like? We're constantly asking that question. Jesus rooted, justice centered, radically inclusive. What are we not radically including? And so like we need to change. If there's something that our community needs and wants, we change. We don't ask other people to change, we change. And so I think affinity spaces are kind of interesting then, because so often it feels like our whole church is kind of a affinity space where we're trying to create safety enough that people come up and say like, I would like you to do this in service. And I say, okay, I've never done that. I don't know if I like that, but like, let's try it, right? So like those are the kind of things that I think we should be thinking about more in church spaces. And I personally, because I have so many intersections, I think that affinity spaces never feel 100% awesome to me, because I'm like, part of me is not included here. And so I would rather, honestly, instead of having affinity spaces, all of us become family who changes for me. And then I change for you, and we all change for one another so that like we're radically included. And like sometimes that means I step up, and sometimes that means I step back, and sometimes that means you step up, and sometimes that means you step back. But like ultimately, like my needs are met and your needs are met.
Yeah, and I think that part of what we're describing here in this conversation, in terms of like taking what is good and holy about affinity, to remain connected to one another, our radical roots, to be always geared towards liberation and to lay down our temptation towards assimilation, it is really like what I might name solidarity groups. Right? So it's like affinity, yes, like put yourself out there, find people who share your experience. Maybe, if you can't do that locally, do it online. Definitely come to places like this, find people who are like you, but also find people who are similarly oppressed, right? Like, let's say that you're the only out queer person in your church. Are there disabled members of your church that are experiencing, marginalization in the community, who may be able to strategize with you, who might be able to relate to you? If you are a BIPOC member of your community and you're feeling really isolated as a BIPOC person, like, are there people who are, neurodivergent? And again, like to your point, like if you are queer and BIPOC and disabled and neurodivergent, like the difficulty of finding somebody who shares your precise experience is going to make affinity really hard. But if you can find other people whose experience of marginalization can connect you in a kind of, I'll just say it, a kind of politics, a kind of radical theology of liberation, then you can start dreaming together about what it means to radicalize or liberate your community and to do that together.
And I was gonna say, that's harder.
Yeah.
Like this is harder, because that means that like sometimes like even like we're married, by the way, and I'd be like, well, you just don't understand because you're white. Right? And like Jonah has to listen to me when I say that. And like we have to talk that out. And like I actually have to believe the best in Jonah, that Jonah's gonna listen to that and that we're gonna struggle through that together. Right? And that's a different kind of work than just showing up and being like, we're all a monolith and like this is such a safe place, even though most of us sitting in that group are probably like, oh, I don't really like how you said that, right? Or like, oh, that didn't feel really good to me because my brother is this, and we're all doing that all the time. And instead of having this like radical conversation about like the struggle that it is to like figure out how to do like the liberative work of like solidarity. So like, I think this is harder work, but I think it's actually, it's more beneficial to our world to do it that way.
And, you had brought up like power analysis, right? Like I think doing solidarity work and building solidarity community requires a strong power analysis. I was a community organizer before I was a church planter, and all we were ever trying to do is build power, right? Power is organize people, organize money, organize, get power, get to the table. And like all of that is real. And we do want to build the kind of power that absolutely upends the church and brings us closer into the kingdom. And the really counterintuitive way to do, I believe, Christian organizing, or like organizing towards power in the manner of Jesus of Nazareth, is to do a power analysis and like head straight for the bottom. Right? Like find the people who have been absolutely shut out from power and go there to build a fundamentally different kind of power. And it's in those spaces, it's wild because when I try to describe what's different about our church community, it's actually really hard because we meet on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. We
I play the guitar and I sing some songs and they might be Hillsong, we'll see.
Yeah, like we stick around after service for coffee and cookie, whatever, right? Like a lot of it is like very similar, and yet it feels so different because of who's there, because of why we're there, because of the ways that we relate to one another in those spaces and constructs. And so I think that, when organizing for power, I think, like my main, my thesis in this conversation is just like, instead of reaching up for power, like reach out, reach down, build power in the margins, because solidarity is just going to get us like even just more glimpses of perfection, right? This is my Wesleyan coming out. You brought it up the other day. So like I'm United Methodist. Wesleyan theology says that we ought to always and ever be striving onward towards perfection, which is a really hard thing to conceptualize. But the way that I've made peace with that is that I don't think that perfection is linear, right? Like I don't think we're like on a linear path towards perfection. I think that perfection is an experience we have, these moments of pure perfection, these moments of kingdom manifestation in the world and in our community. And I just see more of it in solidarity spaces, in spaces where those of us who have been marginalized come together and not only seek to transform the structures and systems of the powers that be, but also just live and be alive and create and generate and enjoy and explore together. So I think that that's so life-giving, that we get what we need there in a way that actually does help us to bring the kingdom into being structurally over time as we face down the empire, but also like in every moment of perfection and joy and connection. So like that's why I came to this conference, and that is what I expect. That is what I expect.
I demand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we will wrap here because it is a short form podcast, believe it or not, given how much we can talk. But if anyone wants to stick around and chat, we will be here. For those listening in person and online, you can always submit your questions to us at christianqueeries@gmail.com.
Just don't forget to keep the queer in queries.
And know that we also have another podcast called Jonah and the Peacock. Season 2 is in production right now and coming out in the next few weeks, where we do deep dives into individuals with overlapping identities of privilege and oppression, grappling with the Bible. And you can find all of this at Zau's website or Spotify, Apple, all the places, all the empires that are still letting us stream radical content.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming.